here. Thank you, Mark, for helping moderate this session today. Before I forget, please feel free to enter any questions that you may have throughout our presentation into the chat box. I think there's just a chat box and not a separate Q&A, so just feel free to enter questions in, and then throughout the presentation or at the end, I guess, depending on where we are. I'm unfortunately not able to see them, but Mark, my co-host, the organizer of the conference, this session, Mark Rayos, and then my co-presenter, Mark Daniels, will be moderating. And I'm Trina Martynowicz. I'm with Region 9, based in San Francisco. I'm in our air division in our technology and partnerships office. So Mark Daniels and I, ITEP, will be presenting today. So thank you so much for everyone who's participating throughout the various weeks of this, of course, very unique, very virtual conference. I first would like to give my warm wishes to all folks who are participating on this call, for you and your loved ones if they've been affected at all by COVID. As we know, COVID has just so unfortunately drastically affected Native American Indians like no other. So my heart really goes out to you guys. And the wildfires also, as if COVID isn't bad enough. I know the wildfires throughout the West have also been just devastating. So just wanted to send our heart out to all of you from EPA Region 9. With that, I will be providing just a quick overview of our presentation today, about an hour or so. We're focusing on essentially what I call free money, but funds for tribes for replacing larger diesel-fueled vehicles or equipment and getting brand new ones that could either be diesel-fueled or another alternative fuel or even battery electric. So we're first going to hear from Mark Daniels at ITEP on the Volkswagen mitigation funding. Around $55 million is available for tribes throughout the nation. Hopefully you're aware of this program, but if not, Mark will go in depth as likely our last round of funding will be available, and that next deadline will be March of next year. The VW funds could fund up to 100% of a new cleaner diesel vehicle, and I said, or alternative fuel if you're scrapping your existing diesel vehicle or equipment or engine and then replacing it with something cleaner. So he'll talk about that program. And then very similar to that program, totally different source of funds, of course, is EPA's Diesel Emission Reduction Act. And so hopefully you're aware of that grant funding program also, but if not, it's a typical EPA grant program versus Volkswagen was directly with the Department of Justice and the Volkswagen company. And so the DIRA program is EPA's grant program, very similar to VW, but providing funding for, once again, scrapping an existing diesel vehicle or equipment and then replacing it with something cleaner. And we may have some changes to this year's program where up to $200,000 may be available for tribes. And then after that $200,000 of EPA funds, the tribe will then have to kick in additional funds. And then in addition, our school bus rebate program is out now. There's 4 different types of programs under the DIRA program. The tribal RFA is a separate program just for tribes. And then we also have a national school bus rebate program where if a tribe has, once again, it has to be diesel, but a diesel fueled school bus that is older, essentially higher polluting, if you scrap that bus and buy a new one, EPA may provide up to $20,000. And it's a super easy, super quick application process. It's just really one page and having to email and scan documents on those school buses. So with that, I will turn it now over to Mark to talk about the Volkswagen settlement. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Trina. So as Trina said, my name is Mark Daniels. I work for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. And I'm going to talk to you today about how to get money from the Volkswagen settlement to do good work in your tribe, in your communities. So first off, a little bit of history about the Volkswagen settlement. You may recall this all kind of happened about 5 years ago now. Volkswagen was caught violating the Clean Air Act for almost 600,000 diesel vehicles they sold over, I think it was about a 10-year period in the United States. And essentially what they were doing is they were caught using software referred to as defeat devices, to cheat on these federal emission tests for certain air pollutants, primarily being oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, which is a serious health and environmental concern. And so the way this worked is, you know, modern cars all have computers in them, and they basically programmed the computers to tell when they were being tested, to tell when the car was being tested versus when it was being actually driven. And so when it was being tested, they went into like low emissions mode and they passed the test just fine. But when they were actually being driven by a real human being, they switched into polluting mode essentially, and they ended up emitting up to 10 to 40 times more NOx than was allowed by the Clean Air Act. So pretty egregious cheating scandal. They were caught by, I think it was some folks from Virginia Tech, I want to say, some researchers. And they alerted the EPA and the California Air Resources Board, who both filed notices of violation against Volkswagen. And Volkswagen ended up settling pretty darn quickly because basically they realized they were caught red-handed and there was no way to get around it. So in the end, they had to pay almost $15 billion to the United States to settle just the cases in the US. There's also cases in other countries. Most of that money went to buying back vehicles, basically getting the cheating vehicles off the road, either buying them back or, if possible, performing modifications, like basically reprogramming the computer so that it didn't cheat anymore. And then some of that money as well, as you can see in the second bullet here, some of that money went to zero emission electric vehicles and EV infrastructure. So they suddenly went from not barely being involved in that field to being a major player in that field. And then finally, number three, and most importantly for our purposes today, a good chunk of that money, almost $2.9 billion, was set aside to fully remediate the excess NOx emissions. And so what we mean by that is basically this money is set aside to fund projects that will reduce diesel emissions in other places to make up for all the excess diesel emissions that they put into the air, NOx and other things that they put into the air with their cheating vehicles. So of that money, nearly $55 million went to the tribes and Alaska Native villages. And I do want to point out, this is the first time that tribal governments have been specifically included in a major public settlement like this. So that's kind of a cool thing. Hopefully that'll be a trend for future settlements. So this money then is being distributed annually through, as Trina mentioned, 2021. Next year is probably going to be the final year of the settlement. There is a slim chance, if there's enough money left over at the end of next year, that they might do another funding cycle in 2022. But we've been told that's unlikely. So basically next year is probably the last year of the program, but there's still plenty of time to participate. And obviously that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is how you can get in on this. Thank you, Trina. So let's talk about who's eligible, first of all, for funding. So as I mentioned, there's almost 2.9 billion total. Most of that went to the states and territories, kind of based on populations. So all 50 states have their own programs. They all got their own chunk of money, and then most of them are kind of re-granting that, or running their own programs. Washington, D.C. and U.S. territories, of course, all got their own money as well. But there is this tribal money, this $55 million set aside for tribes. And for this program, any federally recognized Indian tribe or Alaska Native village can participate. It's also possible intertribal consortia can participate as well. We've seen this a lot up in Alaska primarily, where there's a lot of these very small Native villages that maybe only 30, 40, 100 people or something like that. And so in many cases, they have these intertribal consortia up there, these groups that work with multiple tribes or multiple villages. And because they have, more administrative capability and stuff, being these larger groups like that, in many cases, these consortia will apply on behalf of specific tribes or villages and then kind of help them administer their programs. So I also want to note a couple of things here. One is that, and Trina mentioned this a minute ago, but the tribal DIRA or tribal VW program is not a competitive program. So it's not like a standard grant program where you have to compete with other folks. Basically, any tribe or native village that submits all the required documents and on time will receive funding from this program. So it's kind of cool in that sense. I also want to note, since we're in Region 9 here, that some states, in California being one in Region 9, are actually sharing their state VW funds with tribes, among other groups as well. So like I said, each state or territory got its own pot of money, and then they turn around and they kind of typically they kind of run a program where they re-grant that money to other government agencies or private entities. And in California's case, they also open theirs up to tribes. So for any tribes who are in California, I'm going to talk to you about the VW Tribal program, but just know that you could also look to California and their VW program. I know for right now that they are running a program where they're helping folks replace transit buses and shuttle buses, I think. So anyway, if you're interested in that, it's not something I know a ton about, unfortunately, because there's 50 states and they all have their own programs. I'm just knowledgeable about the tribal program, but if you're interested, you can reach out to California, or I think if you reach out to me, I do have at least a contact or somebody that I can refer you to. So thank you, Trina. So let's talk about the types of things that are eligible, the types of projects you can do with this money. And we're going to do a bit of a deep dive here over the next few slides on this. So first of all, as mentioned, there's 55 million that's available to tribes to reduce NOx emissions. And tribes have to take approved actions to reduce diesel emissions. So there's a list of actions we're going to look at in a few slides here, but it's primarily medium to heavy duty diesel vehicles and equipment. So that can be things like school buses, shuttle buses, delivery or trash trucks, agricultural construction equipment, boats, marine engines, diesel generators. A whole lot of different vehicles or equipment that run diesel are eligible under this program in one way or another. The pictures on this slide show some of the examples, some of the common examples here. And there's some details about this, and we'll go into this a little bit more, but one is that when you're doing this, tribes have to scrap an old diesel vehicle or engine and replace it with a new, cleaner one. That can be either a new diesel or an alternative fuel such as natural gas, or even a zero emission vehicle like an electric or fuel cell. But do know that you do have to scrap an old vehicle. So this isn't just you get a new vehicle if you didn't have any. The idea, again, of mitigation is that we're taking old, dirty diesel vehicles out of service, off the road, and replacing them with new, cleaner vehicles. So those are the different types of things we can look at. There are some other ones that aren't shown here, such as diesel fueled boats, locomotives, other things like that. But anyway, I'll go into detail about specifically what is eligible here. Next slide, please. So this, we mentioned that it's primarily medium to heavy duty vehicles. So what that's based on, at least for road vehicles, what that's based on is these classes that vehicles are divided into. So vehicles are divided into 8 classes based on their gross vehicle weight rating. And for this program, it's everything from class 4 up through 8 is eligible. So smaller vehicles are not eligible, but this graphic here just kind of gives you a visual idea of that. So basically anything from kind of like delivery vans, delivery vehicles, all the way up through, full-size semis, full-size city buses, things like that, dump trucks. Those are the types of vehicles that we're looking at that are eligible here. Next slide, please. So let's go then into the actual types of actions, the specific actions. So first of all, the VW settlement funds are broken into what are referred to as eligible mitigation actions, or EMAs. These are basically the different types of projects you can do. And there's 10 of these. Options 1 through 9, I'll go into some detail on here over the next few slides. Option 10 is the VW DIRA option. Trina is going to talk about more about that in her, or about DIRA in general, at least in her presentation. But I will say for now here, what that basically is it allows a tribe to apply for both Volkswagen money and the DIRA money and combine them to do a project. And in some cases, this allows tribes to do projects that aren't otherwise eligible under Volkswagen because they don't fall into those first 9 categories, because DIRA is kind of a broader program in some ways. But do know that if you do this route, DIRA is a competitive program. So it's a little different than Volkswagen in that sense. But then just, of course, you do end up having to apply to both programs. And the Tribal DIRA grant RFA, I think, is going to come out in March or April, maybe. Trina will probably talk more about that. But anyway, so you just have to manage the 2 different programs. But it can be really useful, and we've had a lot of folks take advantage of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go deeper into the eligible mitigation actions then. So like I said, there's 10 mitigation actions, 1 through 9, and then 10 is the DIRA option. And again, I'm not going to talk too much about DIRA right now because Trina's going to cover that. But there are these 9 on the left side of the screen here that you can see. And the first 8 are all kind of where like we talked about earlier, where you're going to basically take an old vehicle or old piece of equipment out of service and replace it with a new one. Of these first 8, the most commonly used ones by far are numbers 1, 2, and 6. So number 1 is heavy duty class 8 freight trucks, basically, or port drayage trucks, so basically big trucks. Number 2 is medium to large buses, so school buses, shuttle buses, transit buses, things like that. And then number 6 is the medium-sized trucks, medium-sized freight trucks. So those are the most frequently used by far. So most tribes have been doing that. They'll take an old bus or an old truck or something and they'll replace it with a new one. So they're using one of those EMAs. There are some other ones in this group. Most of these have not been used, or at least not very much at all, like locomotive switchers. I don't know if any tribes really have locomotive switchers. Ferries and tugboats, maybe some of the tribes in the Northwest might, but you know, most of these have not been heavily used, except for number 8, the forklifts. There have been a number of tribes that have replaced forklifts. And in this case, you actually have to replace it with an electric forklift, but apparently there's a lot of those out now. So that's good. And then EMA number 9 is different than all the other ones in the sense that you're not retiring an old vehicle and you're not purchasing a new vehicle. You're actually just purchasing the infrastructure for light duty electric vehicles. So basically it's charging stations for electric vehicles or maybe for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And this could be really useful if your tribe is considering developing a fleet of electric vehicles or purchasing some electric vehicles, say for your tribal government or administration or some of your departments. Or if you have a casino or some other tribal business that gets a lot of use from the public and you would like to be able to provide charging stations for the public, you can offer the electricity for free or you can charge money for it as well. There's no restrictions on that. So the requirements for this one though, for EMA number 9, are that a tribe can only use up to 15% of its funding for these charging stations. So we have had a couple of tribes where that's all they wanted to do. They didn't have any vehicles, diesel vehicles they wanted to replace or anything. But unfortunately there is that cap where you can only use up to 15% of your allocation, the amount of funds you get in any given year. But at any rate, it's a good option and a lot of folks have taken advantage of that one. So we highly recommend that as well. So beneficiaries do have the flexibility to choose which of these projects on the list they want to go with. You know, depending on how much money you have in your allocation for the year and what types of projects you do, many tribes might do between 1 and 3 of these different ones, whichever ones fit into their budget and their needs and everything. And then again, I mentioned this before, but the DIRA option number 10 does include there's some overlap. It covers some of the options in 1 through 9, but it also covers a lot of things that are not listed, like generators, farm equipment, construction equipment, things like that don't fall into the normal Volkswagen EMAs 1 through 9. So those have to be done through the DIRA option. Okay, next slide, please. So this is kind of some of the details then about how the program works. And I'm going to focus specifically on those EMAs number 1, 2, and 6, because those are the most frequently used ones. Like I said, medium to large trucks and medium to large buses. But this will give you some of the ideas about some of the restrictions or requirements that are in the program in general. So first of all, like I said, EMA number 1 is large heavy duty trucks, class 8, and EMA number 6 is class 4 through 7 or medium trucks. So those are what's shown in the top half of the slide there. And then in the bottom half of the slide is class 4 through 8 buses. So medium to large buses all got lumped together. And a couple of things I want to point out here. One is the eligible engine model year section of the table on the slide there. So as you can see, for trucks, for medium to large trucks, you have to, the vehicle that you're going to retire, that you're going to be replacing with a new one, has to be from the 1992 to 2009 model year range. So it can't be older than 92. Unfortunately, we know a lot of tribes do use vehicles longer than that, but unfortunately, the way they wrote this, it has to be between 1992 and 2009. The one exception to that, at least on the newer end, is for California, for tribes in California. Because California has stricter requirements, air quality requirements for their vehicles and things in general, the program allows California tribes to replace vehicles up to the 2012 model year. But for Arizona and Nevada, the other states in Region 9, you do have to stick to this 2009 new end cap there. I want to point out with the buses, that's a little different. For some reason, they did not put an early end on the model year range. So basically anything from 2009 or older, or in California, 2012 and older, is eligible to be replaced if you have a bus. So even if you've got a really old bus from like the 80s or 70s or something that you're still using, you can use VW funds to replace that, which is great. And then the other thing I want to point out that's noted on this slide here is the this issue of who owns the vehicle, whether it's government owned or non-government owned. So if it's owned by the government, meaning the tribal government in this case, then you can you can pay for 100% of the cost to replace your vehicle with VW funds. So if you're purchasing, regardless of whether you're purchasing a bus or a truck, if it's owned by the tribal government, you can pay for the entire thing with your VW funds, and you don't have to, kick in any match or anything from the tribe. If it's not government owned, there are different percentages that you can pay for of the cost of the vehicle. And this may sound like, why would a tribe be purchasing something that's not owned by the tribe, or not owned by the tribe? But we've seen this used a couple of times. One is there was a tribe actually in Northern California that didn't really have any diesel vehicles of their own, but they had a couple of businesses owned by tribal members, and they wanted to help them get new vehicles. And so in that case, the vehicle wasn't owned by the tribe, it was owned by a tribal member. So it fell into this other category. The other option I can think of where this has come in play before is up in Alaska. There was a local school district that had a bus that just served this one tribe. Like, that bus was only used to serve this tribe, but it wasn't owned by the tribe. And so the tribe kind of got together with the school district and said, hey, we'll help you purchase this new vehicle. And so the way it works, if it's not government owned, depending on what type of vehicle you're replacing and what type of vehicle what your new one is, whether it's electric or diesel or alternate fuel or whatever, you can get between 25 to 75% of the cost of the vehicle can be paid for with VW funds. And then the other half, or the other portion of the money, would have to be paid for by the tribe or by the owner of the vehicle, or grant funding or some other option like that. Okay, so I think that's pretty good on that one. Let's talk about how you actually access this funding now that we've looked at some of the options and things like that. So as we mentioned, this is probably going to be the last funding cycle next year. There's, by my estimate, and this is just a back of the envelope calculation on my part, but I think there's about $17.5 million left next year. So a good chunk of money. There is a due date of March 16th, 2021, by which tribes have to apply for this funding. And there are several documents that need to be submitted, and they have to be submitted for this first step. They will have to be submitted to both the trustee, which is the bank in Delaware that holds all the funds and kind of administers the program, and then also to the court in San Francisco that kind of did the whole settlement. So these documents have to have signatures from your tribe's leadership, and those signatures have to be notarized on at least one of the forms. And then you have to make sure you get them in by the deadline. And I need to say, this is a hard deadline, this March 16th. It's not like a grant where you just have to have it postmarked by that deadline. It actually has to be received at the trustee and at the court by March 16th, or you will not be able to be deemed a beneficiary, and therefore you won't be able to participate in the program. So we do recommend, it can take a few weeks to get these docs done, and we do strongly recommend that tribes get started now on this, because otherwise it would be easy to miss that deadline, and that would be really unfortunate, because it is probably the last year next year. I also want to say one more thing. This isn't on the slide, but just so that you understand a little bit how this works. So each year, I've mentioned a couple times, each tribe gets an allocation each year. That's the amount of money they're given this each year. And that allocation is determined based on how much money is available total. So as you can see on the slide, I think there's about 17.5 million this coming year. But then it's also dependent on the populations of the tribes that apply. And so the way they do this is, however many tribes want to apply each year, they submit a document to the trustee saying, yes, we want to participate this year, if they're already a beneficiary. And then the trustee they take half of that money that's available for the whole year, and they divide it evenly among all the tribes that want to apply that year. So each tribe gets kind of a base amount of funding, regardless of how small or how large they are. And then the other half of the money is divided up based on kind of a complicated formula, but it's based on population. So larger tribes will get a bigger chunk of that second half of the money, and smaller tribes will get a smaller chunk of that second half of the money. So, and just for reference, this year, the third funding cycle that we're in right now, there was about 16.5 million available, and the allocations ranged on the low end from about 146,000, I want to say, and on the high end up to about 2.1 million for some of the really large tribes. So we can't say what it'll be like next year. It depends entirely on how many tribes apply and what their populations are. but just to give you a ballpark for what people have been getting so far. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So finally, I just want to circle around and talk to you again just briefly about who I work for and why I'm the one telling you about this stuff. So again, I work for ITEP, or the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. And we were actually named in the Volkswagen Settlement to provide technical assistance for this program specifically, for tribes to help get this money. And so we're actually funded out of a small part of the Mitigation Trust Fund, which means that all of our services are offered for free. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time. My whole job basically is helping people get this money, which is, I think, kind of neat. So we do webinars throughout each funding cycle to assist tribes with whatever the next step in the process are at that point. And those webinars are all recorded and on our website, so you can see the previous ones if you want, or you can wait for the next ones that'll be coming up early next year. We also have templates or guides for all of the major documents, so we can give you these templates to help make sure you know what goes in each blank in the forms and things. And then we can also review documents before tribes submit them to the trustee to help avoid common mistakes and minimize the need for revisions afterwards. So a lot of tribes do this. They'll send us their docs, a week or two before the deadline, whatever it is, and say, hey, can you review this? We'll give them some tips and they'll revise it before they submit it. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Trina now. But as Trina said in the beginning, we will be around in the end to answer questions. So please feel free to ask any questions when you get to the end. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I also added in the chat box links to the Volkswagen Settlement, additional information, as well as EPA's DIRA program. So I think hopefully you should be able to copy those links and bring them up as well. So I'm going to talk in a bit more in depth on our EPA Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant program. So as Mark had mentioned, it's similar, yet of course very different, just to keep things complicated. So I'll be going through that program. The broader Diesel Emission Reduction Act program actually is broken down into 4 subsets of smaller funding programs. The whole focus of each of these 4 programs is to reduce diesel emissions from existing, currently operating, mostly generally larger, higher polluting diesel vehicles and engines. Very similar to the Volkswagen Settlement funding. It's not, say, diesel fueled passenger light duty vehicle cars or smaller pickup trucks, for example, but something larger, as Mark said, generally a delivery truck or larger. On-road, like trucks and buses, but then also off-road, like locomotives, ships, construction equipment, and agricultural equipment. So DIRA is broken down into 4 different programs. I'm here to really focus on the tribal grant program, which is competitive, a request for applications, EPA administers, it's open for usually a couple months, tribes apply, and then EPA has a whole competitive process to be reviewing those applications. Though generally, if the application is eligible, EPA has in the past funded each application. And then our school bus rebate program, as I had mentioned, I'll cover that program in more detail in a slide, but it's pretty easy money. It's really just one form that the tribe fills out to get $15,000 to up to $20,000 per new school bus. That application deadline is soon though. So a week from Friday. So next Friday, October 30th at 1 p.m. EPA must receive all documentation on that program. We also have our national grant program that tribes are eligible to apply. There's more money in that funding program, but it's eligible for entities, anyone but a private entity, so nonprofits, and then state or local governments throughout the nation. And then the states also receive an automatic amount of funding also each year. So I will not be talking about those programs. Our DIRA state program though, so since 2009, EPA has been providing this funding. To date, we've provided a little over $11.4 million to 36 tribes throughout the nation. A lot of those tribes are often from EPA Region 9, and then our fellow tribes north in Region 10, mostly in the Oregon, Washington, and a lot of Alaskan villages. We've funded everything from fishing vessels to shore power, to where a boat comes to shore and there's essentially like a long extension cord So the diesel ship engines don't have to run, but instead are running on electric energy. Diesel generators, if there's stationary diesel generators used for primary electricity, we're able to replace those with cleaner diesel or even a renewable energy, say solar PV system. Truck stop electrification, so that's when trucks are stopped at a truck stop, once again, plugging in via like a large electrical outlet rather than running the diesel generators. Ag equipment, mining equipment, I know we funded in Region 9, dump trucks, trash trucks, all sorts of different types of delivery and longer haul trucks, and then as well as buses, everything from school buses to delivery and public transit buses as well. And so Mark mentioned the 10 different VW, 10 different VW options, and the 10th is the DIRA option. And as he mentioned that the tribes must be certified beneficiaries, and we definitely encourage you, as he mentioned, to work with them, with him and ITEP very early on in the process, well before the March deadline, if you would like to participate. With DIRA, the VW funds must be used for non-federal voluntary cost share. So if the DIRA program does have a cost share funding, which I'll talk about in a minute, that is required for potentially over $200,000. That's when the tribe will have to kick in their funding. VW funds cannot be used for that, but for the voluntary cost share part of their funding. And so last year, our DIRA tribal program, the request for applications had around $2 million available. And that was up to $800,000 per application. We were pretty oversubscribed this past year. We had a good number of applications, a lot more than we had received in the past, which was exciting, super great. And then this next funding program, of course, we're in fiscal year 2021 now. We do not know what Congress will fund EPA for this program. We anticipate, we hope it will be the same or at least more. So anticipate around $2 million. Once again, that RFA should be coming out around March, probably a similar time as when the VW beneficiary requirements are. And then the RFA should be out for a couple months as well. So the DIRA school bus rebate program, I want to spend a bit of time, especially because it is open right now and it's a once a year cycle of funding. So this funding will not be available specifically for this program for another year, once again, if next year Congress does fund us for this program. But for all tribes that have existing school buses, and you, the tribe, could own and operate the bus, or it could be owned and or operated by a private school bus company. Regardless, it doesn't matter, everything is eligible. And then depending on the size of the school bus, and it must be diesel fueled once again, but depending on the size of the school bus, you could be receiving a rebate after you scrap your existing older bus and then replace it with a new one that could be fueled with diesel. It could be fueled with CNG, propane, or battery or fuel cell electric. But $15,000 to $20,000 you would receive for each of your buses. I have the website down below, and I think it should be also in the chat box. I definitely encourage you to go to our DIRA program website and read more on this program. There's a maximum number of buses that you could apply for. Unfortunately, this program is really oversubscribed, and so we do have to limit the amount of applications that we are able to process. And so we usually receive quite a bit more applications. And so we then just randomly select applications to fund. It's a kind of a pretty random way of determining who's getting funding or not. There's a timeline also on our website of when, after you submit the application by next Friday, that will, from then of when we'll notify you if you're receiving funding or not. And then it gets into the time frame of when you need to scrap your existing bus, and then when you need to replace your new one. So if any tribes out there who are joining us today are thinking that they need to purchase new school buses, we definitely think that this is a great and very easy program. It really, really is. There's just a one-page form that you have to fill out, and then you submit that to us, as well as proof or documentation that you do have those existing, once again, diesel-fueled school buses, which most school buses, the majority of them in the US are diesel-fueled. So likely if you do have a bus, it probably is diesel or alt fuel, but it must be diesel. And then providing documentation of that bus title and registration, once again, just as proof that that bus exists. And as I mentioned, it could be owned and operated by the tribe or a private or another public entity. Even if it's owned, say, by like the city or county, and it enters your tribal reservation, you could still be working with that city or county to be getting new cleaner buses. And we're happy to serve as resources also if there's any questions on this program well before next Friday. And this funding is completely separate from the Volkswagen Settlement funding, nothing to do with any of that program. So yeah, please let me know if you have questions on that program. Going back to the kind of the broader DIRA tribal program, Mark had a couple slides, photos and list of what types of diesel vehicles are eligible for Volkswagen. DIRA provides a greater flexibility, which is really nice. Volkswagen is a lot more specific and very limited on the types of existing diesel vehicles that could be scrapped and replaced. The types of vehicles and engines that are in red text are DIRA only. So all the black vehicles are VW eligible also, but the marine engines, for example, the boats and ships are only for DIRA. However, Volkswagen will allow the replacement of ferries and tugboats. Locomotives, as Mark mentioned, though I don't know how many tribes have locomotives, but then also off-road construction equipment, ag equipment, mining equipment, that's very unique only to the DIRA program. And as I mentioned too, diesel generators. So if you are using diesel generators as your primary source of electricity that can't be backup power, generators are also available, as well as the other types of vehicles listed here. And as we mentioned, they do have to be medium or heavy duty sized vehicle engines or larger. So in the past, the DIRA tribal program did not, unfortunately, provide 100% of EPA funds, 100% cost to buy a new vehicle or equipment. It was only a percentage. Unlike the Volkswagen, if the tribe owns or operates the vehicle, as Mark had mentioned, Volkswagen covers 100% of the cost. We may have changes for the DIRA program this year, where potentially up to $200,000 of EPA funds could be spent towards a newer vehicle or engine, and anything after $200,000, the tribe then would be required to provide that remaining amount. So for example, if a tribe wants to buy a brand new shuttle bus, for example, around $250,000, EPA would provide the $200,000, and then that remainder $50,000 the tribe would have to cover. It also may depend on the types of vehicles and the types, if it's going to be a new diesel versus, say, a zero emission battery electric or fuel cell vehicle. We're still working on internally exactly what this is going to look like for this next RFA, so we're still not quite sure, but did want to give tribes a heads up that very, very likely up to $200,000 tribes will automatically get for a newer replaced vehicle or equipment. These percentages are from last year's RFA, so are very, very tentative. And then I wanted to go into specific examples and really give huge shout outs to the tribes who have utilized our DIRA grant funding program. It's been so wonderful working with all of them in Region 9. And I think we may have some folks, hopefully, that are still on the call right now. I believe with Gila River, I saw that Jay Johnson and Jerry Jensen are on. And they have received a DIRA grant fund back in 2016 for new school buses. So EPA's provided around $154,000. Gila River provided that same amount. Back then, the RFA required that mandatory match. And like I said, hopefully this next year, up to $200,000 will be waived. And they scrapped 2 of their older diesel school buses and then replaced them with brand new buses. So super exciting. And thank you both for and your whole team for this, working with us on this grant. In addition, I don't know if anyone's on from the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, but they received 2 grants, one more recently, once again from this DIRA tribal program. In 2016, they received around $167,000 for new trash trucks. So once again, they had to scrap their existing trash trucks that are diesel fueled and then replacing them with cleaner diesel trash trucks. And then last year in 2019, they received $283,000 to replace both 2 new school buses as well as 2 backhoes. And there's a photo of a backhoe there. So it's been great working with you all on these programs too. And then finally, last year, in addition, the Blue Lake Rancheria received a grant to replace one of their fire engines with a newer, cleaner diesel engine. As I think folks know, of course, especially in Northern California, has been really, really unfortunately hit with the wildfires recently. And so this was to, once again, scrap one of their existing fire engines and replace it with a newer, cleaner one. And if there's anyone on from Blue Lake, yeah, it's been great working with you all too. So that's kind of the more, I think we've covered everything I think that Mark and I wanted to cover, both on the Volkswagen funding as well as the DIRA program. Just really want to remind folks, if you do have any school buses that are you're interested in replacing with newer, cleaner ones, you could potentially get up to $20,000, $15,000 to $20,000 per new diesel school bus, or it could be an alternative fueled bus. So definitely encourage you to check out our website. And then, yeah, Mark and I will open it up to questions to see if there's anything else folks have specific questions on or just would like us to cover more in depth or elaborate more on.
I believe we have a question from Lisa. Would the DIRA program provide a portion of the purchase of a vehicle that is partially funded by a different program?
That's a great question. For the DIRA tribal program, I guess, or the school-based bus program, yes, potentially. If it's federal funds, we have to look at what funding source it is. Each federal agency has different requirements. So especially under like Department of Transportation, where I know they fund a lot of buses, for example, and Department of Energy as well, especially for a lot of alternative fueled vehicles. Yeah, so depending on what those other, if it's just the federal program requirements are, if it's state funding, local government funding, nonprofit funding, anything but federal, it's usually totally okay to, as we call it, kind of commingle the grant funds together. Yeah, and if there's more specific, a specific funding program, Lisa, that you're interested in, I don't know, I don't think I typed in my contact information. I'll type it into the chat right now, and you're welcome to email me or give me a call directly. Happy to look at that other program with you. Oh, it's GAP funds. That is a good question. I don't know. You think I would know this. I would have to check on that with probably one of our GAP project officers. Great question though. But yeah, if you want to maybe shoot me, I'll put my contact information here, Lisa, and for anyone else also. If you don't mind just shooting me an email, or like I said, or giving me a call. Great question. I think it might be okay. I just don't know. Okay, another question, it looks like from Ian, is the option 10, the Volkswagen funding, like for electric vehicle charging stations, a match? That's a great question. So unfortunately, the DIRA funding, option 10 does not allow for electric vehicle charging stations currently. As I mentioned, Congress, of course, has not given EPA our budget yet for this 2021 fiscal year that we're currently in. And thus we have not launched our request for applications for the tribal funding program. I don't know if that will be an eligible use of funds or not, but definitely the Volkswagen funding, as Mark mentioned, kind of the option 9 up to 15% of the Volkswagen funding is eligible for electric vehicle charging stations. And as Mark mentioned also, I think it's pretty neat, like you charge, the tribes could say provide that electricity, that charging station for free of use, or potentially tribes could also charge entities, like you said, especially if they're like at casinos or public areas where a lot of folks are coming in and charging. Did you want to add anything, Mark?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. In case Ian actually meant option number 9 and was just purely asking about VW, there is no match involved for it. It is, you know, you can, like I said, you can use up to 15% of your allocation for these things. And so from what I've seen, for example, even if a tribe's allocation was say $150,000 total, then 15% of that is $22,500. From what I've seen, from what tribes have applied for, that can buy you maybe 2, possibly even 3 charging stations, probably just 2, but including installation and everything. So we have had a couple of tribes who've just done that. That's all they've done. They didn't take the other 85% of their money. They just took the 15% for the charging stations. They bought 2 or 3 charging stations and put them, you know, wherever they wanted to, and then everybody was happy. So the only restrictions on this, there is no match, but the only restrictions on this is similar to what I showed with the vehicles, where whether it was government owned or non-government owned, you get different percentages. With the charging stations, it depends on where you place them. If you place them on tribally owned land and it's available to the public, accessible to the public, then you can pay for 100% of the cost of your charging stations. But if you put them on non-tribally owned land or on land that's not accessible to the public, then you get less percentages. And so then you could only maybe cover, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it might be like 60% or 50% or something like that of the cost of the charging stations. So that's the only thing to keep in mind when you're buying these charging stations is it's best if you can put them on tribal land that's publicly accessible, and then you're good. You can pay for the whole thing.
Thanks, Mark. Anything else? Any other questions?
So we have one question here. I joined the session late. Will this PowerPoint be available soon? Sorry.
Yeah, do you know, Mark, are we posting all the presentations online, or I wasn't sure.
As long as they're submitted to us, we can have them posted on your session page. So I'll put my email in the chat box and you can send it to me.
Oh, great. Yeah, so yeah, we will make sure this is available. Thank you. And I wasn't sure if it was up there now. Great. Anything else? Yeah, really just encourage folks, especially the next deadline, this school bus rebate program deadline by next Friday. Definitely encourage tribes if you have school buses that you're wanting to replace. Though we also recognize, of course, with COVID and a lot of schools not open. And then, of course, just overall the COVID impacts. I know a lot of folks, I think especially tribes, are having to really reallocate funds. But yeah, if you do happen to be looking to replace your buses, please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to help you with that application. And then, as I mentioned, our DIRA program, probably that RFA should be out around March, very similar time frame to the Volkswagen beneficiary deadline of March 16th of next year. And as Mark mentioned, very, very likely the VW funding's last round will be next year. So this is probably Tribe's last opportunity for around $17-ish million, which is a lot, of course.
I should actually, I was just realizing, and since we have a few minutes here, I should follow up briefly too on the kind of exactly how that works if you do apply for both VW and DIRA. So as Trina said, the RFA is probably coming out sometime in March, early April, maybe at the latest, I don't know. And then so the way that works is you would apply for the DIRA grant, and you, on the assumption that you're going to get VW funds, and I think they'll probably set up the closing date. They did this year in 2020. The EPA will probably set up the closing date for DIRA so that you will know how much money you're getting from Volkswagen before you have to submit your final DIRA application. And so they've tried to kind of integrate the deadlines this way. So basically, you'll find out how much money you're getting from Volkswagen. You'll put together your budget for your DIRA proposal and apply for DIRA, and then you should be selected. If you are selected, you should find out that you're selected before your VW application is due. So we've tried to, not we, but the EPA has tried to get these deadlines lined up with the VW deadlines, which are kind of set in stone, so that you'll know whether or not you've got your DIRA funding before you then apply for VW. Because if you end up not getting selected for DIRA, maybe you've got some other option you might want to do with VW. So you'll find out from DIRA first, and then you'll still have, I think, this year it was maybe a week or two, but hopefully it's a little more than that next year. You'll be able to then say, oh, okay, hey, we didn't get the DIRA grant. Let's go to option number 2 and apply for whatever else we want from Volkswagen. So they've tried to set things up to where neither program is going to block you from being able to participate in the other one based on the deadlines not overlapping or anything. So just so folks know.
Thanks. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it, but yeah, please feel free to reach out to me for any DIRA questions. And of course, another question of program to replace emergency, I'm assuming, backup diesel generators as compared to prime power. Unfortunately, right now, not under EPA's DIRA program. Really, the funding is only for generators that are for primary electricity, prime power, because that's where the higher diesel emissions are being, the opportunity for them to being reduced versus just backup power. And we know that there's, especially now with the wildfires, once again, a lot of folks whose previously backup diesel generators have been used quite a bit because of the PSPS power shutoffs by our utilities. But also if generators that were permitted for backup that are now being used as prime may also trigger local air district or EPA permitting requirements if they are being used a certain number of hours. And I don't know that number off the top of my head, and I think it actually varies on which airshed and if you were in an EPA non-attainment area or not. So as of right now, no, unfortunately, there's no EPA funding for such. And I don't think that that's going to change in the RFA this next year, unfortunately. A great question. Yeah, anything else? But yeah, and if folks are interested in learning more about the Volkswagen funding, of course, Mark is a great resource. The ITEP website has a lot of really good information too. And they also have monthly webinars. I don't know if Mark, if you want to maybe just take a few minutes to talk through those and how they're more broad besides just on VW.
Oh, well, yeah, I think maybe there's a couple of different things going on here. The VW program does webinars, not explicitly monthly, but once the funding cycle starts getting going, so, and actually before the funding cycle starts too. So I think we'll probably have our first webinars in maybe late January or something of next year to help folks who are trying to meet that March deadline. And then we'll probably do, you know, a couple of them before the deadline. And then after the deadline, we'll have another 3 or 4 or 5 or so throughout the course of the funding cycle. And like I said in my presentation, basically when we do a webinar, it's usually geared towards whatever the next thing is folks have to be working on, whatever the next deadline is. But then I think you may be referring also just ITEP in general does a lot of webinars on lots of other topics as well. And so, you know, if you go to our website there and then just go up to kind of the ITEP home from there, you'll see lots of options for all sorts of other webinars on different air quality topics and water quality and solid waste and other things. But yeah, as far as the VW ones, they're not on a specific schedule. It's more based on where we are in the funding cycle. And then the other thing, I did kind of allude to this in my talk, or I think I mentioned it, but we have recorded webinars from previous things on our website already. So if you go to that website that's linked on the page you're seeing right now, and then you go to training, I think it's called training resources, that tab or whatever, that has a bunch of our old webinars recorded that you can watch. So if you don't want to wait, you know, if you want to get going now and you kind of want to get some background information on, say, how to fill out the forms to become a beneficiary or something like that, you can see a webinar now with all the questions and answers and stuff that people asked. Or as I said, we will be doing more live webinars coming up next year. We also, I should say too, we have a listserv that you can get on if you would like, so that you can get notified about these webinars. So if you're not already on that listserv and you want to be on that listserv so that you'll know when there's upcoming webinars and things, just send me an email at my contact there and I'll put you onto our listserv. And then we don't spam you. It's not, you know, a bunch of emails every week or anything. It's just when there's something coming up.
Great, thanks, Mark. I think with that, it looks like we're almost at time. So thank you all for participating. Please feel free to reach out to Mark or myself if there's any questions. Thank you, other Mark Rayos, for helping facilitate the call, and then Melissa, of course, for you and all of your support. So thanks all.
Yeah, thank you. Great session.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.